Hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to be back with you again as we continue our ongoing series of messages I call Home Remedies. And what these are, if you haven't been with us, are really a simple one-way conversations basically between me and you, where we talk about the complexities of relationships, particularly marriage and family, but also every other relationship we have in our life. One of the things we know from experience is that the Bible speaks to every issue of importance in our life, and relationships are the most and central relationship or issue in our life. I mean, our relationship with God the Father to begin with, but also our relationships in marriage, in family, and even in the workplace. And so what we're trying to do is really kind of delve into this issue a little deeper and hopefully gain some greater insights. I guess the bottom line is that we can be more effective and have happier and healthier relationships than maybe most of us had up to this time. The difficulty is we live in a culture that's becoming increasingly non-relational, and many kids are growing up spending their time watching screens, and if they see relationships played out in front of their eyes, they're artificial or virtual relationships. In other words, they don't reflect reality. They may reflect our highest ideals, or in some cases, our lowest standards. But nonetheless, it speaks to the issue of how important it is, and yet they're not learning or developing the kind of essential skills that they need to have and be able to navigate relationships in their day-to-day life. And I think that we see that manifested not only in the high level of divorce and the choice of many couples not to make commitments to marriage. In fact, the number of people between 25 and 45 that are married today has dropped in just the last 15 or so years from 50% of the population down to about 35% of the population. So what we see is increasingly, people are choosing not to marry. They're choosing to stay single because being in relationship is a difficult thing. It's challenging. And most people would rather choose to avoid relationships and delve deeper into just pleasuring themselves rather than developing a meaningful interactive relationship with another person in real life. But I want to cover a couple of topics this week and next week that may not initially seem to be connected, but they, in a very real sense, very much are connected. What I want to talk about next week is about conflict in marriage and how to have a fair fight. In other words, how do we sit down and have a disagreement and work through it without everything blowing up and creating a real big, ugly mess? But before we can do that, I want to begin by looking at what is the number one reason that people have conflict in marriage. And it surprises people because in our age of kind of overt sexuality, where we act as if people are sexually compatible, or if they, in other words, find pleasure in a sexual relationship, that means that they're going to be a good fix. In fact, that's often one of the arguments that's used for cohabitating before marriage. But in reality, that's a much smaller issue than most people realize. I often say that sex in marriage is kind of like the blossom on the rose, but the stem and the roots are something quite different. And one of the most essential areas, most common area for marriage breakup is money. People disagreeing over money issues. And the reason is deeper than we might think. Most people think if I just had more money, then I would be happier. And yet studies have found that people always feel that they need to make 10% more than they do currently in order to be financially secure and to be financially happy. But what we discover is that, as Solomon would put it in Proverbs, he said, or Ecclesiastes, he says, as goods increase, so do they who eat of them. And so basically, the more money we make, the more demands there are upon that money. Not only speaking of the IRS and other taxing agencies, but also just the lifestyle changes we go through. We take on more obligations because they're, in our mind, more affordable. And yet, these can begin to place real stresses, particularly in times like we're in right now. Many of you right now are really conflicted because you found yourself having your employment threatened, or the regularity of your income. There's some of you who have been unemployed. You haven't been able to collect unemployment insurance yet for reasons that are somewhat understandable but very frustrating. You may or may not have gotten a stimulus check. Some of you have gotten them, some of you haven't, and there's not much of an avenue to check it out. But worst of all, there are people who simply have seen their industry go away, and now they're really loose and have to find a new way of making a living, or maybe even having to develop a new career. Those kind of things create huge stresses, and they're also part of the pattern of life. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going into that, but I do want to get to something much more basic, and that's the fact that money matters are really the number one issue that leads to marital conflict and also marital breakup. And I have really basically 4 points that I would like to hit on. And this is a very simplified version. We have a course that we offer through the Ramsey's financial organization called Personal Financial Freedom. And I would encourage you to sign up for one of those classes the next time it's offered. But in lieu of that, I just want to give people a few ideas or things to hang on to begin to think about. And maybe as a husband and wife in particular, or parents with their children, you can begin having these conversations about money, because one of the things that we find is that young people in particular have no concept of how to manage money. It's one of those areas where most parents have not had a great deal of success, and they really don't know what to tell their kids. And the next generation that's coming along is finding themselves drowning in debt, particularly student debt. And so there's just a few basic principles you can use to begin the conversation, and I try to support them with biblical passages. The first thing is, I think that when it talks about money, especially in marriage, you're talking about shared monies, you have to begin by identifying what your goals are, and you have to agree on what those are. Now, goals is kind of a misleading term, because really our financial goals are basically our values. What we see as valuable. What do we see value in spending our money on? I know some people who their highest value is always to have a new car, or the next car, or a better car, a faster car, whatever it is. And so to them, spending money on always upgrading their vehicle is a key central issue in their life. But if a wife comes from a very different orientation, or a husband from a different background, where they simply say, no, we need to look at the most practical, the most cost efficient, the most least expensive, then you're going to find that there's going to be some tension there between you on those kind of things. And that's really where we begin with Amos says in Amos 3:3, he says, can two walk together unless they're agreed? And that's really where you have to sit down and come to some kind of agreement that as you talk through these things. Now, preferably, two people have had this conversation before they ever got married. And that's one of the things we try to accomplish through our premarital counseling program. And I would really encourage, if you're thinking about getting married, or your young people are getting married, don't let them do it, or you don't do it, until you've had a chance to go through something like our premarital program, or one similar to it, where these kind of issues actually become part of the conversation. Because it's not about how much money you make, or necessarily about what you spend it on, but most importantly, what do you feel is the right and most profitable way to spend those monies? Some people are spenders, some people are savers. The happiest people are probably someplace in between. But again, if two people are huge savers, that's great. They agree on that, and they choose the lifestyle that they have as a consequence. But if one of you likes to spend and one of you likes to save, which is more often the dynamic in marriage relationships, well, this becomes a real issue of conflict, and you have to come to an agreement on what the values are. What are the things that we're going to focus on first and foremost in our relationship? The second concept you need to keep in mind is that you need to spend less than you earn. In Proverbs 13:23, this is from the King James Version, it says, much food is in the tillage of the poor. Now, the tillage is what you plant and harvest from the ground. Much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. In other words, some people simply are always in financial problems because, first of all, they never correlate how much they make with how much they spend. And I know many people just simply do not have a personal budget. And a budget is a really easy thing to orient. Basically, you start at the top and you say, this is how much money I make every month. And then on the second column, you have, how much do I spend? And you simply make a list of all your expenses and you subtract that from your income. And at the bottom line, you have what's left over. That's the money that you can use on other things. Now, making a budget is a lot more complicated than that in the fact that you need to know what kind of things to forecast for. It's really great if you can afford to do it, to have an emergency fund, to have a savings account, to have retirement funds that you're setting aside, and any number of things like that, because most people who budget don't include everything they need to think about, and they're caught off guard. But nonetheless, that's really a foundational principle. You need to agree on what that budget's going to look like, and you can find a lot of places online or books that will help you in forming that budget, or again, our financial classes that we offer. But the bottom line is you have to understand the foundational principle. You can't spend more than you make for very long. Now, in the age of credit cards, that's become very easy to do, and there is really one of the challenges that we'll have to face, and we'll talk about that last of all. But the third thing I want to hit on, and I hit it third because if you don't agree on what your goals are and you don't ever budget your money, then the third one becomes an impossibility. And that's basically that we learn to honor God with our monies. Proverbs 3:9, Solomon wrote the following, says, honor God, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled with overflowing and your vats will brim over with new wine. Now, it was Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, who rebuked Israel because they weren't paying their tithes and offerings to the Lord. And listen to what he says. He says, will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. And then he says, but you ask, how do we rob God? In tithes and offerings. And he goes on to explain, you are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and vines in your field will not eat their fruit, says the Lord Almighty. Then all nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land, says the Lord Almighty. Now, the contemporary argument that people often raise is saying, well, tithing was a covenant aspect of the Old Testament relationship. In other words, Israel was required to tithe. It was part of the law, and therefore we're not under the law, so it doesn't apply to us. The problem is that tithing predates Moses and the Mosaic law. It predates the nation of Israel. The first person we read about tithing is actually Abraham. So we have Abraham who's offering tithes to the Lord. He's not under the law. He's not under any Mosaic regulations. He's doing it as a way of honoring God. And the concept of tithing is to give God the first portion. Literally, the term in its most literal translation of tithe is the top of the heap. But it came down to when they moved from an agriculture to a monetary culture, they basically stipulated that that was 1/10 of their income. The first 10% of their monies they would give to the Lord. Now, it's not for anybody, myself included, to designate where that giving should go or how you should donate it. But my wife and I have found that from the moment we began to tithe on our income, which was very, very small, but from the earliest days of our marriage relationship, we started doing it. And we've just found that God has blown our brains out with the increase that he gives. It's amazing how we've seen God provide. And we found that God was able to do more with the 90% we kept than if we had kept the whole 100%. In other words, giving that 10% seemed like, well, how are we going to make ends meet if we do that? We discovered that God has a way of stretching dollars to make them go further. And so many of you think, I need more income. Actually, probably what you need is more faith. More faith to begin honoring the Lord with the first fruits of your increase, and then letting God bless you in ways that you hadn't anticipated. Now, I know for many of you, this is really frightening stuff, and you may have already turned me off because you don't want to hear this anymore. But I'm just saying that, and I share this from a personal experience, but also a pastoral concern, that I want to see you blessed as my life has been blessed and many others who have learned to adopt this discipline, that you find this blessing comes on your life. And God can do, as Paul said to the Ephesians, exceeding abundantly above and beyond all that you can think or ask. But you'll never get to experience that if you don't take that first step of faith. So I would just put this challenge out to you. Try it for a few months. Try giving him just 1% or maybe 5%. And one of the things you'll see is that God will reciprocate. He'll build your faith by showing you the wisdom of taking that step of faith. Which brings me to the very last item, the fourth item. We've talked about how you need to have agreement on your goals, what you want to spend your money on, what your financial targets are. Secondly, you need to spend less than you earn. Thirdly, you need to learn how to honor God with your income. So what is the fourth one? Avoid debt. Now, it's impossible to completely avoid debt. And in fact, if you don't have some debt history, then you can't really develop what they call your credit character. And because of the cost of many things are so high that it's impossible to really buy a house or buy a car or many other things without having some ability to take on debt. Now, the Bible does prohibit Christians from charging other Christians' debts, but basically banks and other financial institutions aren't Christian organizations, and there's no restriction from them lending to you. So I don't think that taking out a loan is wrong. In fact, I think it can be very helpful in providing a home and other necessary goods. But you have to realize, as Proverbs 22:7 says, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. It's not surprising that the richest people in the world are involved in financial investments. And those investments basically have a high return on what they invest. And that's why banks tend to grow into huge financial institutions. The bottom line is that debt really makes people rich. So that if you invest in a retirement program of some kind, well, the bottom line is that you're giving your monies to probably some other financial institution that then is reinvesting those and earning interest. And that interest, that increase or that rate of growth really helps you to prepare yourself for the future, because not only does interest grow over time, but so also does inflation. The value of your dollar actually becomes less as time goes on. So that if you make 10% interest a year on your monies, and inflation is 10% a year, God forbid, but if it were, basically you would be no further ahead than when you started. And so the idea is to have an adequate funds for your retirement, but also to be able to have funds in reserve. And there's nothing that eats up your wealth faster than debt. It's one of the things that's most troubling about our current circumstances. You know, we thought it was terrible under the previous administration that they doubled the national debt. I mean, when George Bush left office, there was $10 trillion in debt, and we thought that was scandalous. Now it was 20 trillion when moving on to 21 when Obama left office. And since Trump has been in office, it's gone up even higher. In fact, it's estimated that the cost of the present shutdowns and all the rest is going to be around, lead us with about 30 trillion in debt. Countries can't sustain that. People can't sustain that. Debt steals your money. And particularly when somebody one day says, well, you have to pay off your debt. Many people right now are in financial trouble because they borrowed money. I know people who are actually would be considered extremely wealthy by most of us, who saw good financial times, and so they made long-term investments. They put out money to acquire properties and other things, saying this was a good time to do it, and didn't know that all of a sudden they would be put out of business. I think of one incident of an individual who's a plastic surgeon who suddenly had acquired all of these extra properties, and then he was put out of business because it was ruled that what he did was non-essential. Well, that's what happens with debt, and that's why we can't avoid every unforeseen circumstances. That's why we call it unforeseen. But we can be wise and most of all prayerful. I tell people, before you take on debt, pray about it. Ask God to give you clarity and insight about it. And He'll direct you away from things that are unwise. He'll close doors if you ask Him to. But if you just simply pursue what you want because you can, you're going to find yourself in trouble. And see, that's part of the idea of honoring God with your funds. Honoring God is not just tithes and offerings. Honoring God also is using the monies you have with the will of God in mind, and not simply the way you want to use it. That you step back and say, Lord, is this something that you would have me spend money on? Well, I'm just about out of time, and so I need to wrap it up. But I hope these few points, the idea of identifying what your goals are, spending less than you earn, honoring God with your money, and avoiding debt, just these four things can be on the basis of a really meaningful conversation and could really prove to rescue many marriages. Because again, this is one of the areas we have the greatest conflict. So thank you again for taking this time to listen to me. I hope you found this valuable and helpful and insightful. And we'll pick it up next time on the other side when we talk about conflict in marriage and how to, what I call, have a fair fight, because you're going to have them. So God bless you and go in his grace.